You're listening to the Intercoastal Podcast, part of the Destination Marketing Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Intercoastal Podcast, where we explore the people, places, and stories that make the Beaufort, Port Royal, Sea Islands so unforgettable. I'm your host, Daquan Mickens. In today's episode, we have a pivotal moment in our history that happened right beneath our feet. A battle that proved the Low Country resolve long before the nation was fully formed. Our guest today, Stephen Wise, leader, military historian, author, and the curator of the Parris Island Museum. We'll start by talking with the first shots fired from Beaufort District and, why the small hill in the Low Country became the symbol of the American defiance. So, without any further ado, we have Stephen Wise, the South Carolina 250 celebration to kind of get us going. So let's jump in. So, Stephen, before we get going, you've written a book about the history of Beaufort County. What first drew you into the Revolutionary War and the history specific to the island?
Well, the book I wrote actually was on the Civil War in the area, but I worked with Larry Rowland, who wrote the first volume of the history of Beaufort County, and that handles the American Revolution. And since I've moved here, because at the Parris Island Museum, we deal with local military history. So we have a section at our museum on the Revolution in this area. And that sort of was my first introduction to the Revolution, what occurred here, primarily the actions that are on Port Royal Island, around Port Royal Island and Beaufort.
Okay. And could you tell us a little bit more about kind of what drew you to the Civil War to write that book? Or have you always had a passion for the Civil War?
Oh, always had a passion for it. I grew up during the centennial of the Civil War and all the TV shows, the games, the toy soldiers, all that sort of kept me interested in the Civil War. And I was lucky enough to sort of keep with it throughout my college career.
Yeah. So I'd tell a lot of people, and I've said it numerous times on this podcast, when I went to college, my best friends were all history majors. So I was history adjacent and forced kind of to get the history. I would go over their house and they'd have the History Channel on, and it kind of made me a history buff. And then when I moved to Beaufort, it kind of expanded on that. So I kind of understand from someone's perspective who wasn't 100% history enthusiast and kind of getting that history. And now that I'm here talking to you about Beaufort's 250, not realizing how much of a pivotal point Beaufort played into the Civil War, the Revolutionary War. Could you explain to someone who might not know how pivotal Beaufort was to everything in both Civil and Revolutionary War?
Well, I mean, they're completely different, but in the Revolution, the area here was one of the richest areas in not only South Carolina, but in the United States. A number of leaders came out of this region, both locally, statewide, and eventually Continental Congress and the new nation. And during the war, this area will be traversed a number of times by the British. There'll be actions both here on Port Royal Island, occupation of Beaufort. There'll be movements in the interior of the county through areas like Pocatello, Coosawhatchee. So it will be, especially from 1779 on, very much on the forefront of the war. There'll even be some experiences with the French, who then joined with an unsuccessful attack against Savannah. All these things will revolve around the men, the units that came out of the Beaufort district.
So on February 3rd, 1779, the Battle of Port Royal Island took place. For those who aren't military buffs, can you paint a picture of what was at stake when the British landed at Laurel Bay?
Well, you got to go back even farther than that. By the end of 1778, the British were now in an international war. France had entered the war on the side of the colonies. The Spanish were about ready to join into it as well. So Great Britain had to rework its strategy for the American Revolution. Their campaigns in the north had failed by now. The Battle of Saratoga, where the British lost an army, and that, of course, led to France recognizing the United States and becoming a partner in this war. The they were forced to pull back tighter to a ring of defenses around the city of New York. Over half of the men that had been stationed in the colonies now have to be sent to such areas as the West Indies, to Gibraltar, to India, to even guard the homeland, to guard the islands of Great Britain against possible attack by the French and the Spanish. So the British, to just put it basically, high command, and those who were directing the war in Great Britain, are going to send directives to their commander, this is Henry Clinton, in New York. And their idea now was, okay, we have failed in trying to separate New England from the rest of the states. We failed with our campaigns here in the northern part of the United States. Let's look this and let's look at a strategy to knock the southern states out of this war. And they believed that there was a tremendous loyalist population, and there was a fairly substantial loyalist population in the southern states. And they thought if they could connect with these loyalists, they could work their way up from Georgia through South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And if you knock all these states out of the war, it may force the United States to compromise, to give up the war, or come to some sort of conclusion to end the war with Great Britain, possibly staying in the British Empire, or maybe some sort of other type of status that would occur. So in December of 1778, a British expeditionary force captured Savannah, Georgia. And that was the first start of this campaign. And the British they came down from the city of New York, captured, it was an amphibious attack on Savannah. They capture Savannah, and then British forces move up from St. Augustine, and they all unite in Savannah. And the commander of the British was a fellow named Augustin Prevost. And Prevost was under direction to take over areas in Georgia, to begin recruiting loyalists, arming the loyalists, helping to supplement the British forces, and then move on into South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia. And South Carolina is the richest colony. People argue that South Carolina was the major bankroller of this war. Virginia, sort of the political leadership, and a large number of soldiers came out of Virginia, especially if you could knock South Carolina and Virginia out of the war. It could really change the outcome of what would occur. So what Prevost is going to do is he's going to direct a campaign from Savannah up to Augusta, Georgia. The idea being they'll seize Augusta, Georgia, which is a fairly frontier town, but it's located where the western part of South Carolina and even up into North Carolina, and they could use Augusta, Georgia as a rendezvous point, a rallying point for loyalists. Now, he is in February. Actually, he's going to start in January, late January of 1779. They're going to start this expedition from Savannah up to capture Augusta, basically marching along the western side of the Savannah River. He needs a diversion to sort of freeze the Americans. The Americans that they could concentrate on their forces will outnumber the British. So he needs a diversion, and this diversion is going to lead to an expedition coming into Port Royal Sound. So while the British are marching out of Savannah, Georgia, moving along the western side of the Savannah River towards Augusta, the Prevost is also going to authorize a raid into Port Royal Sound. The idea of going to Port Royal Sound, threaten the islands, threaten the rear of the American army that's marching up towards Augusta, that might pull some of the Americans back and give the British a better opportunity not only to seize Augusta, but hold Augusta and again use it as this spot to bring together loyalists that then could be used to invade South Carolina, North Carolina, and Virginia.
Okay. Yeah, so this is just me wondering, why do you feel like there were so many, like the loyalist popularity was so strong in the South?
Used to be always the sort of rule of thumb was 1/3 the people favored the revolution, 1/3 were neutral, 1/3 were loyalists. and it's difficult to say, but the western population of South Carolina and North Carolina, there were a lot of loyalists. Now, why? It's hard to say. They're looking to the British to help defend them against the Indian tribes. They were mad at the low country planters because you definitely had this division between the small farmers in these states who didn't have slaves, didn't have a lot of money, and politically were sort of held down by the low country elites. The low country elites, because of a combination of you had to have property to vote. You had to have even more property to hold political office. And so it held back a lot of these backcountry people who didn't have a lot of property, didn't have a lot of money, and were denied in many cases positions within the government or positions of influence. And even before the Revolution, there were fights between the low country and the backcountry. The backcountry saying, wait a minute, this is unfair. One person, one vote. Oh, no, it wasn't that. It was one person with property, more votes than one person, one vote. So, there was an underlying causes to a number of loyalists as well. And the heavy-handedness in South Carolina, especially against loyalists. And early in the war, if you didn't make an oath to the new revolutionary government, you were run out of town, basically, for all intents and purposes. So people were watching that as well. If it was as many as the British thought would be backing them, it's hard to say, because there'd be a lot of action back and forth between the two sides up there. But the British needed loyalists now to fight the war.
Yeah.
And even though they weren't quite sure how good of loyal soldiers they would make, they needed them. And so they were hoping that they could tap into this reserve of soldiers.
Okay. And I'm in the motor coach industry. We do sales for motor coach. And I've always heard Prevost motor coaches, that's kind of like the company that manufactures all the big buses across the country. And I never knew why it was called Prevost. So now I have an idea of where they got the name from and how the company kind of got the name.
Yeah, he was a well-established British commander. He fought in the French and Indian Wars. He will for a while command the area in Georgia, South Carolina, and until about early 1780.
Okay, yeah. So that's fun to kind of know now moving forward. You often mention General William Moultrie and the Beaufort artillery. Why was what their stand at the Great Hill so surprising to the British regulars?
It wasn't that surprising, but what occurs is the raid will come into Port Royal Sound. It takes them. They leave Tybee Roads January 26 and sail through Skull Creek. And it's a very long, laborious movement for them because the main vessel of the British naval force was the HMS Vigilant. And the Vigilant was a merchantman, had been a transport early in the war, and then converted basically into a floating battery. Was given so many cannons, she was very low in the water and not a very good sailor, and he put these real heavy cannons on, but what she was used for, and she was used for this at Philadelphia when they attacked forts outside of Philadelphia, this number of cannons put on board. She was like a floating battery that could just overwhelm an enemy with the firing of her cannons. But to get her through Skull Creek, they had to tow her. They had to do something called kedging or caging, which is where you go out and you drop an anchor in front, and then you use the capstan that usually you use to pull in the anchors. Well, it pulls your ship forward through the shallow waters. They had to go on shore and put hawsers onto trees and pull her that way. Yeah. And it takes literally 5 days to get from Tybee Roads into Port Royal Sound.
Oof, yeah.
And when she came into Port Royal Sound, the Americans or the Patriots had a base on Bay Point at the mouth of Port Royal Sound. And this was a battery of cannons watching for British movement. And their idea was, as soon as you saw the British coming into Port Royal Sound, they would fire their cannons, which would then alert the forces at Beaufort, basically Fort Littleton, which was a big tabby fortification on what is today Spanish Point.
Okay.
So on January 30th, as they spot the British flotilla coming through Skull Creek and coming into Port Royal Sound, they fire their cannons. And this warns the Americans at Fort Littleton. Problem is, they were firing the cannons to tell, okay, they're coming, get ready.
Yeah.
But they fired the cannons, and Fort Littleton was manned by only about a dozen Continental artillerymen under the command of Jean d'Etreville and 50 to 100 militiamen. The militiamen ran away. They didn't want to be there and take on these British vessels. So d'Etreville basically, well, I can't hold this place with 10 men.
Yeah.
So he's going to spike some of the cannons, which makes the cannons inoperable. He destroys some of the equipment, and then he takes his men and he leaves Port Royal Island. He goes down to where today US 21 crosses Whale Branch. We have a nice bridge there. Well, this time there was a ferry, and he ferries across there, and there's an American position on the other side. The British come on into Port Royal Sound. They raid along both the mainland side and on Port Royal Island. They burn Stephen Bull's house at Laurel Bay. They destroy one of the Hayward's homes over on the mainland off U-Haul Creek. And then they decide, then they're trying to make up their mind what they should do next. Because they're really just a raid. They're not a major movement, but the British commander, William Gardner, that he commands 3 companies of light infantry. And light infantrymen are, the way your regiments were set up back then, you had what was called just a line regiment, line companies, and line companies were just your normal soldiers.
Okay.
And then each regiment would have a grenadier company. These are your biggest, tallest men. They were given the big, tall hats because they even made them look bigger. And they're called grenadiers because originally you got your biggest, strongest men because to throw grenades. Well, now they were just sort of an elite unit of your regiment.
Okay.
And then you also had what's called a light company. And these were men who used short rifles. They had a little shorter coat. They were like your skirmishers, your scouts,
Quicker.
light infantry. They were operated in loose formations. So you had 3 companies of these, and what they would do is they would group these units together. So they'd take all the grenadiers of all the regiments and put them into a grenadier regiment. And that was sort of your elite force. Same thing with your light infantry. You would put them together. They would be a special force to send out and do scouting and raids and such for you. So you had 3 companies of these light infantrymen. And William Gardner was the commander of these 3 companies. And he wanted to do something more than just raid. He wanted to actually go ashore. So on the evening of February 2nd, they dropped down the river to about where Whale Branch feeds into the Broad River. It's where Clarendon Plantation is today.
Okay.
And it was a Henry Talbert's home is where they land on the evening of February 2nd. In the meantime, word of the British coming into Port Royal Sound has reached the American High Command. The American High Command is under Benjamin Lincoln, and Lincoln is marching with his men up to Augusta.
Okay.
And he hears about this raid, so he dispatches William Moultrie to assist in stopping this raid. And so William Moultrie, along with Stephen Bull, who was the commander of the militia in this area, are going to form up men at Port Royal Ferry. This is on the mainland side of Port Royal Ferry. And it includes Colleton County Militia, or Colleton District Militia, as was known then, and Charleston District Militia. They were all militiamen. Now, the Charleston militiamen were fairly well trained because they came from the city, and there was a good grouping of them. And they also are going to give them 2 pieces of artillery from the 4th South Carolina Continental Regiment. 4th South Carolina Continental Regiment was the artillery regiment. And so we have two 6-pound guns. And interestingly enough, they're commanded by two guys who had signed the Declaration of Independence, Edward Rutledge and Thomas Hayward Jr.
Yep.
And so with these men, Moultrie and Bull are going to leave about half their men back at Port Royal Ferry and take about 300 men on February 2nd and cross at the ferry. And while the British are still out in the Broad River, some of them, they are firing at the Bull House at Laurel Bay, they're going to march up to Beaufort. And they're going to have with them Jean d'Etreville and his 10 men, who also were Continental artillerymen. And they're going to come into Beaufort on February 2nd, go down to Fort Littleton, pick up supplies there. And then while they are in this area on February 3rd, they learn the British have landed on Port Royal Island. And so now Moultrie takes his force out of Beaufort to go down to seek the British.
Yeah. That's so interesting because you can visually see, like, when you name certain places that are still here today and you name where they're attacking, where they're marching up to, and you visually see it, it's really cool to kind of envision that. And for guests coming to the area who want to see these spots or kind of map it out in their head, it's pretty cool to see.
Yeah, they basically want to meet very close to what was called the Halfway House.
Mm-hmm.
And Halfway House is just that, 6 miles from Beaufort and 6 miles from Port Royal Ferry.
Yeah.
So, and you can easily set your odometer on your car and be right there.
Yeah. Well, as a historian who spent decades at Parris Island, how do you see the vibe of our local history changing as we approach the 250th anniversary?
Oh, it's bringing a lot of attention to the area. Even this week, there's going to be some commemorations here at the Arsenal. There's going to be something Thursday night, and then on Saturday, there'll be some reenactors and other groups. We have a very active 250th committee that's promoting all sorts of different events. I guess we're having a first person Benjamin Franklin arriving sometime soon. There's going to be some tours done through the continuing education, the OLLI programs, both boat tours and bus tours. And then some of us are doing lectures for the OLLI classes as well.
Yeah, and that's great. They kind of get everybody involved of all ages, students, they could learn. And it's great to kind of encompass all of that in the 250th.
Yeah, we do. We have just out at Parris Island, at the Parris Island Museum, we have a brand new exhibit on the 250th anniversary of the Continental Marines and talk about their service during the Revolution.
Yeah. And why is understanding this 1779 victory essential in telling the true story of the Sea Islands?
Well, it's we are so often, this area, especially the South and South Carolina, is always arguing there. Like if you look at their license plate, something about the war being won in South Carolina. Usually, now I'm from Ohio, and there when we talk about the American Revolution, we talk about George Rogers Clark and the activities in the Ohio or along the Ohio River. But for a longest time, most of the emphasis on studying the American Revolution would be on the northern campaigns. And you have to, I mean, you have to look at this Boston, City of New York, Newport, Rhode Island, and of course, Battle of Saratoga, which everybody points to as the turning point of the war because that brings France in. But now South Carolina is having the opportunity to sort of talk about what went on here. And there are some tremendous parks, 96 cow pens, Kings Mountain. Those are all national parks. They'll be doing at Fort Moultrie, that's the site of Fort Sullivan, which was the fort that stopped the British attack on Charleston in 1776. They're going to be doing things there. And then there's numerous smaller battlefields that groups the state and the South Carolina Battleground Trust are working on developing and putting together something called the Liberty Trail to get people to visit these areas. And hopefully we'll be able to do some things with the Battle of Port Royal Island. Because on that day, on February 3rd, the British They march inland. They march down the Port Royal ferry and find it very well defended. And then they turn to go back to their ships. And you can even and still envision where the causeways were going through the marshes and everything. And as they're coming back to their ships, they are skirmishing with some of the Patriots, and they then realize that Moultrie and General Bull have come out of Beaufort and have taken up a position very close to where today the drive-in movie theater is located.
Okay.
And you can still see some of the terrain of what it was like, and still see some of the marsh. And see, it's just a little bit beyond the where the halfway house was. Now, the British didn't have to engage. They could have fallen back to their ships. They could have gone down what is basically today the road that takes you into Clarendon Plantation. But instead they could see the American forces drawn up on a very slight rise on the other side of a kind of a marshy, swampy area. And the British, being the British, they weren't going to pass up the fight. And so they marched toward the Moultrie's forces, and the fight will then occur around 4 p.m. on February 3rd.
Oh, yeah, that's pretty cool. Well, this is a good time to transition. There's a weight to the ground that we walk on here in the Low Country, and Stephen has a way of making you feel the pulse of 1779 in the modern day. So now let's talk about how we are bringing those 250-year-old stories into the present day for locals and visitors alike. So we are currently in the heart of the South Carolina 250 commemoration. What are visitors to expect to see when they come to Beaufort this season, from new markers to historical reenactments? I know you mentioned this week there's reenactments, but if someone was coming maybe like in July for the 250th or, moving forward, what are some things they could expect?
Well, there are some places that have actual displays right now on the American Revolution. The Arsenal Museum, the Beaufort History Museum, has information on the American Revolution, and they will be opening up this week a video on basically describing the coming of the Revolution, talking about what it was like in the Beaufort district in 1775. They'll jump back to 1772, talk about the attempt by the British governor to have an assembly occur here in Beaufort. They have a couple of displays on that, but it's real an interesting way of how they do it, through animation and pictures of original places that still exist. They're going to discuss the feelings of everything from the planter class down to the slaves as to their feelings of the war, why they might be for or against the war, or maybe we should stay neutral, or boy, whoever wins, we're going to be in trouble.
Yeah.
And they do a nice job describing that, and describing on the Sea Islands, they grew a crop called indigo, and they emphasize in the growing of indigo and how that helped make this area quite wealthy. You have, as I already mentioned, the museum on Parris Island, where we have both our normal exhibit on the Revolutionary area and our new exhibit on the Continental Marines. The Discovery Museum on Hilton Head is going to have some events as well. And there'll be a reenactment this weekend here in Beaufort, and they'll keep that up. The Revolution lasted a long time. It goes from 1775 to 1783. So hopefully we can keep all this enthusiasm up and going. There's going to be some events out at the site of the Battle of Port Royal. The county does own a portion of the battlefield, and there's work going on to do something out there. Right now, the plans are for a passive park with walkways and some kiosks and some stops, so you can get an idea of the battle, where it was fought. It wasn't a very large battle. The lines on both sides are only about 200 yards in length as they faced off against each other. And if you can still kind of see it, it's if you're at it's the site of what was called the Pillow Factory. That's the area that's been turned over to the county. But the Patriot cannons would have been basically right in the center of US 21, firing down straight at the British. Then their line would have extended across 21 into what is today the air station. And that's where Jean d'Etreville had his men, and they had a little 2-pound cannon called a grasshopper, because it was on three little stands, and it would sort of hop whenever you fired it. And then the militia units were drawn up across the road.
Yeah.
And again, it was both Colleton district and Charleston district. It was a mixture. When you called the militia out, you never called all of them out at once. So it was sort of a mixture of various companies. And among the men there was a large number of Jewish members of the militia from Charleston who had formed up a company, and a good portion of them were there as well at the battle. And the British themselves, they came forward and stopped at the halfway house, demanded that Moultrie and his men surrender. They, of course, turned it down. In fact, they said, you should surrender to us. And so I guess neither of us are going to surrender. But the British were caught in a tough spot because they couldn't get through the marsh. There was a marsh between them and the American line. So they had to take a causeway through the marsh. And some of the marsh is still there. You can still see some of the marsh. And as they're doing that, you're in what's called column, which means you're tightly, almost shoulder to shoulder coming through, and you're just a perfect target.
Yeah.
So that's when the artillery just pulverized them as they were coming through, wounding a number of their officers. Then when they get across, they have to form into line again. Again, they're doing this under the fire of now the militia who are firing muskets at them.
Yeah.
But then when they form their line, they come forward. And in this battle, you're literally fighting each other 50 yards apart, because that was the basic range of the muskets. Now, the British light infantry had rifles, so they were more accurate, but they didn't have a very long range because they were short rifles.
Yeah.
And the battle's only going to last about 45 minutes until, for all intents and purposes, both sides start running out of ammunition, and both sides start pulling back from their lines. And in the battles, you use drummers to basically you drum out a command. And on the British side, William Gardner ordered a pullback. He said, we're not getting anywhere. We're losing too many men, and we're going to pull back. But part of his command couldn't hear the drummers, so they kept fighting. And then on the American side, they had a guy named Jim Capers. Capers was a slave from north of Charleston. He had joined the Continental Forces with members of the Capers family. And he was one of the drummers there on the American side as this as well. And everybody pulls back except for one portion of the British forces, and they come forward and say, well, we don't want to retreat, because we retreat, we have to go back down that causeway and we'll be sitting ducks. So they come forward as the Americans are pulling back. Americans pull their artillery back because they don't want to see that get captured. And so you could argue the British actually held the field, and then they said, well, now we got to get out of here. So they pulled back. And then the Moultrie orders this group of dragoons, and these were very well-placed, very rich individuals under John Barnwell. John Barnwell probably was the most active of any patriot from this area. He would have been the grandson of Tuscarora Jack Barnwell, the founder of Beaufort. His dad was Nathaniel Barnwell. And they sweep around behind the British, but in the confusion, most of the British do get away and fall back to their ships and then basically leave the area. But Moultrie has chased the British off of Port Royal Island. Can't do anything to them on their ships. He has no way of attacking the British ships. But he did. You could very well argue that this was a victory for the Patriots. They'd driven the British off of Port Royal Island. They didn't seize Beaufort. They didn't advance up to Fort Littleton. They do fall back to their ships. But strategically, Tactically, it was a victory for the Americans. Strategically, Moultrie's going to realize we can't hold this area. We have no way to fight off the British ships. They control all the waterways. They can land anywhere. Fort Lyttelton's guns have been spiked. Part of the fort's been damaged. So after about a week, they're going to leave Port Royal Island, leave Beaufort, and go back to the mainland and establish positions on the mainland. Basically, again, we're 21 crosses over to the mainland.
Okay. Make it a little easier for them to hold.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Logistically, they can't get cut off. The British ships can't get behind you when you're on the mainland.
Yeah, it makes it a little easier. So you're involved with the South Carolina Battleground Preservation Trust. Are those specific sites on Port Royal Island that people can visit today to see where these first shots occurred?
Yeah, you can visit. There's a pull-off there at what's called the Pillow Factory. There's what's called a state marker. You can see the state marker from the road, and there's plenty of parking to come over. We're hoping to be able to put up some more signage to give you an idea. Okay, here's where you are. Here's where the battle was. Here are the lines were. That's still in the works. Okay. There's a committee working on that right now, and it's the Beaufort District 250th Battle of Port Royal Committee that's doing this. And then they also are in touch with the Battleground Trust.
Okay. Yeah, that's good to hear and great for visitors looking to kind of get that information when they're driving down so they can see exactly where everything was at. Talk to us about the Passport to Freedom and other programs. How are we teaching the next generation to be stewards of the revolutionary legacy?
There's a lot of work with the students, I guess best way to put it, high school, grade school students. And that's one of the emphasis coming out of the state 250th committee. So if you're applying for grants to do something, one of the conditions is that it's got to be made available to public school students, be it high school or grade school. In South Carolina, you teach world history in 8th grade, and a lot of them are using, because the American Revolution was a worldwide war by the end of the war, and so that a lot of the grants have in it specific that you need to open this up to school children. And in fact, what they did at the Beaufort Arsenal, they tailored that for I think it's 4th grade or 5th grade that they learn South Carolina history in the public schools. So
yeah, well, it's good that you guys are kind of have a plan implemented. In, like we said, we want to give the next generation like a runway and to learn their South Carolina history. From the Gullah Geechee influence on the war effort to the local militia, how does that history foster the sense of belonging for people living here today?
That's a tough one. In the American Revolution, the enslaved population were caught between two fires. You really, well, we could support this side, but what might happen to us with them, or we can stay here on the plantation where our homes are and where our children are and take our chances here. You just really didn't know. And so you see all sides to it. When the expedition came in here in February of 1779, boatloads of escaping slaves came out to the British vessels, thinking, okay, maybe we'll get freedom. Well, your British officers owned plantations in the West Indies, so a lot of them may have been shipped there and just gone from. And you have to look at slavery in many ways as a comparative. If you had to be a slave, and nobody wanted to be a slave, if you had to be a slave and had your choice between being on an indigo plantation on Port Royal Island or in a sugarcane plantation in the West Indies, you wanted to stay here at Port Royal. The West Indies, you had a life expectancy of about 5 years. So you have to sort of, but they didn't know that. They thought maybe, and some were given their freedom. Some were taken in as laborers as part of the British forces. There even was a company of dragoons made up of former slaves who fought with the British around Charleston. So you took your chances. And if you stayed here, and your area was overrun by the Loyalists. The Loyalists could seize you and take you to their plantations. And then later, if you were working for a Loyalist, the Patriots could capture your area and you could be taken to a plantation owned by the Patriots.
Yeah.
And it was, some fled to the Indian tribes and went out west. Some organized their own settlements, much like the Seminoles, and a lot of them did end up in Florida, into the Georgia swamps and things, just to escape. So the British promised protection. They never quite promised freedom, though some did get freedom. When the war is over and the British evacuate Savannah and later Charleston, some are sent to Nova Scotia, and some eventually worked their way to Sierra Leone, which was the British colony for freed slaves.
Okay.
So it's a really mixed bag as to what happens to these people. Probably tens of thousands of them were dislocated, relocated during the American Revolution.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is tough. And like you said, a mixed bag. It makes it tougher to know exactly what happened to everybody, but it just depends on location and time.
And some did fight in the American militia units. There were numerous attempts by individuals like John Lawrence to offer freedom to any slave who would fight on the American side, but the South Carolina legislature continuously turned that down. So it's a mixed bag. It really is.
And then the final question is, what do you hope the listeners feel the next time they drive past Grays Hill or visit the Beaufort waterfront? What do you hope that they take with them from this episode?
Well, I hope hope we do get a nice little, even if it is a passive park, to stop and see where the battlefield was located. At least we have about 1/3 of the battlefield preserved now, and get an idea of the fight, and then come into Beaufort and understand the importance of the waterways, of the Beaufort area, of individuals like Thomas Hayward Jr., John Barnwell, Stephen Bull, who all were part of the action here, and to understand that it was a war of two sides, that you had the DeVoes and the Kelses and others who fought for the British side. And just to get a good feel of history and get a good overview of how much occurred here and how we can still learn today from it.
Yes, and that's the important part, is learning and making sure it grows and everyone can get that information. So, Stephen, thank you for spending your time with us and giving us your tireless work and preserving the stories of the Low Country. But before we wrap, could you give the folks where they can go to learn about Beaufort SC 250 or the events, or visit the Parris Island Museum?
There's websites. Just type in Parris Island Museum, and we have a website through the Marine Corps. We have the Parris Island Historical Foundation, and they have a website too. They help support the museum with some of our activities. The Beaufort District 250th have a website, and we constantly list the events that are occurring there. The Beaufort History Museum, the Beaufort County Library is a good source. They disseminate a lot of information of all the events that are going on here, and then watch the Ollie catalog, because myself, John McCardle, and others do talks on the American Revolution for the continuing education program.
Okay, well, thank you so much for being on. We appreciate it. And that'll be our episode for today. Huge thanks to Dr. Stephen Wise for sharing his passion into the revolutionary past. Don't forget to follow us at visit_Beaufort SC on Instagram and subscribe so you never miss an episode of our stories that shaped the Sea Islands. Until next time.
This has been another episode of the Intercoastal Podcast, hosted by Daquan Mickens and the team at Visit Beaufort, Port Royal, and the Sea Islands. Produced by Revolt.